Behind the towering walls of San Quentin, where death row inmates await their final fate, a shocking murder shattered the illusion of control. One condemned man killed another in cold blood. But why? Betrayal? Gang orders? Or justice from within? The truth inside America's most secure prison is darker than imagined. In the shadows of the San Francisco Bay, where the fog curls like ghostly fingers around razor wire, stands San Quentin State Prison, California's oldest and most infamous correctional facility. For more than a century, it has held some of the most dangerous men in America, and within its high-security walls lies a place few ever see: the death row unit. It's a world of isolation, silence, and waiting, where men sentenced to die spend their final years confined to small concrete cells, surrounded by others just like them. Yet even in this environment, where every movement is controlled and every threat supposedly contained, violence still finds a way to breathe. On the morning of August 24, 2017, an event unfolded that would shake even the seasoned officers of San Quentin. Jonathan Fajardo, a 30-year-old inmate known for his connection to racially motivated murders, walked into the exercise yard for what seemed like a routine recreation period. The air was heavy with heat, and the faint echo of footsteps on the yard's concrete surface filled the stillness. Across from him was another condemned man, Luis Rodriguez, older, quiet, but with eyes that had long learned how to hide intent. The two men had been cleared for the same recreation slot, something that was supposed to be safe under the strict supervision of guards. Yet in a place where loyalties run deeper than rules, danger can erupt without warning. Fajardo's story began long before that day. Born and raised in Los Angeles, he was drawn early into the chaos of street gangs that defined so many lives in the city's rougher neighborhoods. By his late teens, he had joined the 13th Street Gang, a Latino street crew that had earned a reputation for violent turf wars and racial animosity. For Fajardo, the gang wasn't just a group of friends. It was an identity, a shield, and a source of power. That loyalty, however, would also become the chain that dragged him toward death row. In December 2006, a 14-year-old girl named Cheryl Green was standing outside with friends in a neighborhood known for racial tension. She was African American, a child full of energy and dreams. But to Fajardo and his fellow gang members, she represented something they hated, not as a person, but as part of a race they had been taught to see as rivals. That day, Fajardo and another gang member drove into the neighborhood. Without hesitation, he opened fire on a group of teenagers. Cheryl was struck and killed instantly, her young life extinguished in a senseless act of hate. The murder sent shockwaves through Los Angeles, exposing the deep racial violence festering beneath the surface of the city's gang culture. In the weeks that followed, detectives closed in on Fajardo. When he began to suspect that one of his own, Christopher Ashe, had been cooperating with authorities, Fajardo's paranoia turned lethal. He lured Ashe to a location under the guise of trust and then brutally murdered him. A gang cleansing, meant to silence a potential informant. The dual crimes sealed Fajardo's fate. Arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, including one classified as a hate crime, he showed little emotion during trial. Witnesses spoke of his cold demeanor, his unflinching gaze as prosecutors detailed the horror of his actions. In 2011, he was convicted and sentenced to death. San Quentin became his new home, a fortress of gray walls and steel doors, where each inmate lives in a space barely larger than a walk-in closet. Fajardo, like many others on death row, adjusted quickly. In the strange rhythm of prison life, time moves differently. Each day is predictable, each sound familiar. The clang of doors, the echo of boots, the faint hum of radios in the guard station. Yet beneath the surface calm, an invisible network thrived, one built on gang loyalty, smuggled messages, and a strict code of conduct. Even behind bars, Fajardo remained tied to his gang's world. Luis Rodriguez shared a similar path. He, too, had been swallowed by the cycle of violence that defined California's gang wars. Convicted for a brutal murder during a robbery years earlier, Rodriguez was sentenced to die and transferred to San Quentin's death row. He was older than Fajardo, quieter, but in prison silence doesn't mean peace. It means patience. Within the ranks of the Latino prison gangs, Rodriguez held a reputation, not loud or visible, but respected enough that others listened when he spoke. Prison records describe him as compliant, disciplined, and without major incidents. But those who knew the culture inside knew what that meant. He played by the code, not by the prison's rules. By 2017, both men had spent years living under the same roof, never friends but part of the same racial and gang ecosystem. The death row exercise yard was one of the few places where inmates could see daylight. Even then, they were separated into small, fenced dog-run cages. Security was supposed to ensure that no two potentially hostile inmates shared space. But human error, or perhaps manipulation, made this day different. Guards escorted both Fajardo and Rodriguez to the same enclosed yard. The men were unshackled and given their brief freedom to move, stretch, and breathe fresh air. What happened next lasted less than a minute. As soon as the restraints came off, Rodriguez lunged forward with a weapon he had hidden. A sharp, handmade blade fashioned from metal scraps, its handle wrapped tightly in cloth. Surveillance footage later showed almost no warning. Fajardo turned slightly, perhaps to speak, and Rodriguez struck with precision. The first blow pierced Fajardo's neck, and the next drove deep into his chest. Guards shouted. Alarms blared. But within seconds, the attack was over. Blood stained the concrete. Rodriguez dropped the weapon, his face expressionless, as Fajardo collapsed onto the ground. Medical teams rushed in, performing desperate measures, but the damage was fatal. Fajardo was pronounced dead shortly after being taken from the yard. His death marked one of the few times in modern California history that a death row inmate was murdered by another condemned man. For the officers who witnessed it, the shock was visible. Inside a place designed to control every second of every life, violence had still found its way through. News of the killing spread quickly through San Quentin. Among the inmates, whispers began almost immediately, speculation about gang politics, about an order sent from higher ranks, about debts or discipline. In death row culture, very little happens without purpose. Yet officially, investigators found no clear motive. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation launched an internal review, questioning how such a breach could occur. Both men were supposed to be kept under constant separation. The weapon should have been impossible to smuggle in. But Rodriguez had managed both, and the prison's most secure unit was suddenly under the harsh light of public scrutiny. For the families on the outside, the news carried a different weight. To Cheryl Green's family, Fajardo's death felt like a distant echo of justice, not through the system, but by the same violence he had once unleashed. To prison officials, it was a failure. And to those who knew San Quentin, it was another reminder that even among the condemned, the instinct for power and survival never dies. As the prison locked down in the hours after the murder, Rodriguez was escorted back to his cell, alive, calm, and already sentenced to die. No new trial, no new punishment could change that. For the rest of the inmates, the message was clear. Death row may promise isolation, but it does not promise safety. In a place built to hold men waiting for execution, death had come by the hand of one of their own. When news of Jonathan Fajardo's murder reached beyond the walls of San Quentin, it was first treated as a prison statistic, another incident in a place where danger was part of daily existence. But as reporters and investigators began to peel back the layers, the story took on a darker complexity. How could a killing occur inside the most heavily guarded section of California's most secure prison? Death row was built for separation, for control. Inmates there lived alone, ate alone, and were allowed out only in small cages for brief recreation, watched by armed guards from every angle. For two condemned men to come face to face in the same yard, and for one to smuggle a homemade weapon inside, pointed to something more than coincidence. It hinted at a failure in the very system meant to contain them. The investigation began immediately. Rodriguez was isolated in a high-security holding cell, stripped of all privileges, and questioned by correctional investigators. He didn't resist. In fact, he spoke very little. When asked why he did it, he simply said, "It had to be done." Those 5 words became the center of speculation. For weeks, rumors rippled through the prison population. Some inmates whispered that Fajardo had broken a gang rule, that his execution had been ordered from inside the same networks that once protected him. Others claimed that Rodriguez had acted out of personal vengeance, that the killing was punishment for something that had happened years before, long before either man had come to death row. Inside San Quentin, gangs are not just a presence, they are an invisible government. Divided by race, loyalty, and geography, these groups control everything from contraband flow to the unwritten laws that govern inmate behavior. Even among condemned men whose fates are already sealed, the hierarchy remains absolute. The Latino gangs, in particular, have intricate chains of command, often extending from prison to the streets and even across other facilities. Orders can travel through coded letters, secret gestures, or messages slipped through visiting attorneys. If a green light is given on an inmate, a death order, there are few places to hide. Jonathan Fajardo's case carried symbolic weight within those circles. His crime, the racially motivated killing of a young black girl, had been widely publicized, making him a hero to some and a liability to others. Inside prison, open racial attacks can ignite riots or draw unwanted attention from authorities, something prison gangs try to avoid at all costs. It's possible that Fajardo's notoriety had become a problem. Officials later confirmed that in the months before his death, Fajardo had been moved between cells due to security concerns. No one said what those concerns were, but some suspected that the administration had received threats against him. Still, on that August morning, the decision was made or allowed to place him in the same recreation yard as Luis Rodriguez. The yard itself was a narrow space surrounded by chain-link fencing topped with coils of razor wire. The ground was cracked concrete, scarred by decades of California sun. To the guards, it was just another day. To Rodriguez, it was the moment he had waited for. The weapon he used was crude but deadly. A sharpened piece of metal with a rag-wrapped handle, easily hidden in the waistband of his jumpsuit. It had been made, investigators later believed, from a piece of a light fixture or vent cover. The precision of the attack suggested planning, not impulse. After the murder, forensic teams swept the area. Blood spattered the wall and streaked the ground. The shank was bagged as evidence, its surface etched with faint scratches where it had been sharpened. The entire death row block was locked down, and every cell was searched. Dozens of hidden blades, metal fragments, and makeshift tools were found, silent proof that violence had been fermenting beneath the surface long before Fajardo's death. Outside the prison, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation faced mounting criticism. Journalists demanded answers. How could a condemned prisoner die at the hands of another condemned man? Family members of victims were divided. Some saw the killing as poetic justice, others as a sign that the system had lost control. The department released a brief statement acknowledging the incident and promising a full review. But inside San Quentin, the staff knew that answers were rarely simple. For the correctional officers who worked death row, the murder hit hard. They were accustomed to tension, to the unpredictable volatility of men with nothing left to lose. But this, a breach of security so fatal, felt like a personal failure. In interviews, some described the eerie silence that followed. The prisoners, usually loud and restless, became quiet, as if collectively holding their breath. The code of silence ruled the tier. No one would talk. Rodriguez, meanwhile, returned to his isolation cell, where he resumed the still, almost monk-like demeanor he had carried for years. He neither asked for a lawyer nor expressed remorse. He simply waited. Investigators pieced together fragments of the two men's history. They had both been part of the same larger network of Latino gangs, though not necessarily the same subset. Prison intelligence suspected a dispute over loyalty, possibly that Fajardo had refused to follow an internal directive or had been accused of cooperating with prison staff. Whatever the reason, the order was clear. He was no longer protected. In gang culture, especially within death row's rigid codes, such a betrayal is punishable only by death. As days turned into weeks, the story faded from headlines, replaced by new tragedies and new crimes. But inside the walls, the echo of that morning lingered. Fajardo's cell was cleared out, his personal items boxed and stored, letters, legal documents, and a few photographs. They painted a picture of a man who had spent years reflecting but not repenting. His death, for many, closed a chapter that had begun with the murder of Cheryl Green more than a decade earlier. Yet for San Quentin it opened a new one, a chapter about failure, secrecy, and the fragile illusion of control in a place built to contain the uncontrollable. Corrections officers privately admitted that death row had become increasingly unstable. Overcrowding, understaffing, and a growing number of condemned inmates had made management nearly impossible. With California's death penalty system effectively frozen, executions halted since 2006, the condemned were no longer facing imminent death by the state. Instead, they were living indefinite sentences under the title of death row. That stagnation bred frustration, and frustration, in turn, bred violence. For men like Rodriguez, already facing eternity behind bars, the consequences of killing another inmate were meaningless. Psychologists who worked with the prison system later suggested that death row fosters a particular kind of hopeless aggression. The isolation strips men of identity, leaving only the gang to fill the void. Loyalty becomes a religion, violence becomes expression, and in that environment, a single perceived betrayal can ignite lethal action. The internal investigation eventually concluded that Rodriguez had acted alone, though it never fully explained how he obtained or smuggled the weapon into the yard. No staff members were formally disciplined, and no official report blamed systemic negligence. The story quietly disappeared from public attention, filed away as an anomaly. Yet to those inside, it was a warning that even within the concrete heart of California's death penalty system, control was an illusion. In the months after the killing, Fajardo's name faded from the records of active inmates. His case file was marked deceased. The line beneath read, cause, homicide. For the victims of his crimes, that word carried a strange symmetry. For the system that created both him and Rodriguez, it was just another entry, another death in a place designed for them. But beneath the paperwork and procedures, one truth remained. No matter how high the walls, San Quentin could never fully cage the violence it was built to contain. In the weeks that followed Jonathan Fajardo's death, San Quentin remained on edge. The steel doors clanged louder, the air felt heavier, and even the most seasoned guards carried an unspoken tension in their eyes. Every movement, every sound in the cell blocks seemed charged with uncertainty. The murder had pierced a hole in the illusion of order that kept death row functioning. Though officially it was described as an isolated incident, everyone inside the prison knew that violence like this was never random. In a place where every inmate's life is measured by routines, the unspoken question lingered. Who allowed it to happen, and why? Luis Rodriguez's days after the killing followed a grim rhythm. He was locked in solitary confinement, the kind reserved for inmates deemed too dangerous to mix with others, though on death row isolation was already the norm. He spent 23 hours a day alone in a small concrete cell, the single slit of a window allowing only a narrow beam of light to cut through the darkness. To the correctional officers who checked on him, he was calm, almost unnervingly so. He didn't ask for extra food or privileges. He didn't argue. He spent hours sitting motionless on his bunk, staring at the wall, lost in thoughts no one could read. When questioned again by investigators, his answer hadn't changed. It had to be done. Behind those words, investigators sensed a deeper story, one woven from the codes and shadows of prison politics. The prison's intelligence unit quietly circulated memos linking the murder to gang orders. While there was no official confirmation, whispers inside San Quentin suggested that Fajardo's death had been a cleanup. In gang terms, a cleanup meant eliminating someone who had either violated internal discipline or become a liability. Some sources claimed Fajardo had been suspected of talking too openly with prison counselors, possibly hinting at cooperation. Others said it had nothing to do with betrayal but rather with settling an old score tied to his crimes on the outside. Whatever the truth, Rodriguez had fulfilled an order, one that came from a world invisible to those who ran the prison. Outside the walls, the case barely made headlines. It was a brief story in local papers, overshadowed by the chaos of politics, natural disasters, and the everyday churn of American crime. For most people, Jonathan Fajardo's name was already tied to infamy, the man who had murdered a child out of racial hatred. Few cared that his life had ended violently in return. But for those who study the psychology of crime and punishment, the case raised unsettling questions. What happens when men condemned to die begin carrying out their own executions behind bars? What justice exists when a murderer becomes a murder victim, and his killer is already awaiting death? Inside San Quentin, death row continued to function as it always had. Meals were served through small slots and doors. Lights flickered on and off at fixed hours, and the shuffle of chains marked every movement. Yet something had changed, a quiet recognition among both inmates and officers that control was far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. The investigation wrapped up months later with an official finding that Rodriguez acted alone. There were no additional charges filed, no criminal trial, no new sentence. His punishment, in the eyes of the law, was redundant. He was already marked for death. Still, within the walls, men whispered about him like a ghost. To some, Rodriguez became a symbol, the man who carried out prison justice. To others, he was a warning, a reminder that loyalty can be demanded even in hell. When the lockdown finally lifted, the rhythm of prison life resumed. The yard reopened, the tiers echoed again with shouted conversations, and new inmates filled the cells left empty by death and decay. But among the condemned, the story of what happened in that yard lived on as part of San Quentin's dark folklore. Far beyond those walls, the echoes of Fajardo's crimes continued to haunt the families he had destroyed. For Cheryl Green's mother, news of his death came in a short letter from prison officials. She had spent over a decade attending hearings, watching appeals, and waiting for the state to execute the man who had taken her daughter. His death didn't bring the closure she had imagined. Instead, it brought confusion. Not triumph, not sorrow, just emptiness. He didn't face what he did, she said later. He didn't have to sit there and hear her name again in court. He just got taken out, like it was nothing. Her words captured a painful truth. Vengeance and justice rarely meet in the same place. For the staff of San Quentin, the aftermath brought new rules and tighter security. Exercise times were restructured, searches became more frequent, and the already strict segregation between condemned inmates grew even harsher. Yet those who had worked there long enough knew that change in a place like San Quentin was only temporary. Violence might sleep for a while, but it never truly dies. The same walls that contained men like Fajardo and Rodriguez had seen countless others before them. Men whose lives and deaths were buried beneath decades of concrete and silence. In the larger picture, Fajardo's murder became a reflection of the death penalty system itself, a system caught in a paradox. California hadn't executed anyone since 2006, yet hundreds of men remained on death row, living in suspended sentences that stretched on for decades. For some, that endless waiting became its own punishment. For others, like Rodriguez, it became an opportunity, a way to keep existing within the code of the gangs that shaped them. The state might have sentenced them to die, but inside, they created their own rules of life and death. In his final report, one investigator wrote, "Inmates like Rodriguez have nothing to lose. The system's ultimate punishment has already been given, which means deterrence no longer exists." That statement captured the quiet futility surrounding death row. When a man already condemned commits another murder, there is no further penalty that can reach him. It was a reminder that even the death penalty, the most severe punishment in American law, cannot eliminate the cycle of violence that creates men like these. Years later, when the case was mentioned again in a criminology study, it was cited as a rare example of intra-death row homicide, a phrase that sounded clinical, almost detached. But behind that term was a story of blood, hatred, and fate colliding within one of the most controlled environments on Earth. A system designed to prevent violence had instead become the stage for it. Jonathan Fajardo, once a symbol of hate and brutality, had met a death that mirrored his own cruelty. Luis Rodriguez, the man who delivered it, remained where he always was, waiting in a cell, counting days that no longer mattered. At San Quentin, the sun still rises over the same rust-colored rooftops, casting long shadows through the bars of death row. The guards still make their rounds, keys jangling, radios crackling. The men inside still breathe, still eat, still wait. Somewhere among them, the ghost of Jonathan Fajardo lingers, not as a martyr, not as a villain, but as a reminder of how easily violence repeats itself when a system loses sight of the humanity it was built to control. In the end, both men, killer and killed, became reflections of the same truth. In a place meant to deliver justice, death came not from the state, but from the very hands of those it had condemned. And that truth, silent and unresolved, remains locked inside the walls of San Quentin, echoing long after their voices are gone. One ordinary morning in Atlanta turned into a scene of unimaginable terror when a courtroom erupted in gunfire. A judge, a deputy, and innocent bystanders fell victim to a desperate man's rampage. But in the chaos, one woman's courage would transform fear into faith and end the bloodshed forever. Morning broke over downtown Atlanta on March 11, 2005, like any other day. A cool, gray Friday with people bustling through the heart of the city. But inside the Fulton County Courthouse, a man named Brian Nichols was about to alter the city's sense of safety forever. At 33, Nichols was no ordinary defendant. He was strong, intelligent, and, by all accounts, dangerously unpredictable. Once a college athlete and a computer technician, he now stood accused of brutally assaulting and raping his ex-girlfriend. It was a case that had already drawn local attention, and as the trial neared its climax, tension surrounded every step of his movement through the courthouse corridors. What no one realized that morning was that Nichols had already made a decision. He was not going back to prison. Deputy Cynthia Hall had been assigned to escort Nichols from the holding area to the courtroom. She was a disciplined officer in her early 50s, respected for her professionalism, and known for treating even the most difficult inmates with calm authority. But courthouse security protocols were loose that day. Despite Nichols being flagged as a high-risk inmate, he was transported alone, without handcuffs, and under the watch of a single deputy. The hallways buzzed with routine courthouse activity. Clerks, attorneys, and witnesses moved in and out of rooms, while Nichols quietly plotted his escape. In the small holding cell adjacent to the courtroom, Hall instructed Nichols to remove his street clothes and prepare for the trial. As she turned to open the door, Nichols lunged. What followed was a burst of ferocity that stunned investigators later. Nichols, towering at 6'1", overpowered her instantly, beating her with relentless punches. The struggle was violent and swift. The sound of it barely carried beyond the holding cell. Hall tried to reach for her radio, but Nichols struck her again, fracturing bones and leaving her unconscious on the floor. In that moment, the fragile barrier between a defendant and chaos was shattered. Nichols took her service pistol, stripped off his jail uniform, and put on her dark jacket. It was a disguise that bought him just enough time. He walked calmly out of the holding cell, weapon concealed, passing through the courthouse corridors like any other officer. Witnesses later recalled seeing a man in a deputy's uniform, but none sensed anything amiss. Nichols' expression was focused, unreadable. A man who knew his only way out was through violence. He made his way toward the courtroom of Superior Court Judge Roland W. Barnes. Judge Barnes, 64, was a well-liked jurist known for his gentle tone and fair rulings. He had built a reputation for patience and dignity, often mentoring young lawyers and treating every defendant with respect. In the courtroom that morning sat court reporter Julie and Brandow, 46, who had worked alongside the judge for years. The trial was moments from resuming when Nichols entered through a side door, weapon drawn. There was a pause, brief, deadly, and then the first shot rang out. Judge Barnes collapsed instantly, fatally wounded. Panic erupted as people dove for cover. Nichols turned and shot Brandow before she could react, her notepad slipping from her hands. Within seconds, the courtroom became a scene of blood and horror. The gunshots echoed through the courthouse, sending clerks, lawyers, and jurors fleeing for safety. Nichols ran, moving swiftly down stairwells and through corridors, pushing past terrified employees. As he burst through the courthouse doors, a pursuing officer, Deputy Hoyt Teasley, spotted him and gave chase. Teasley, a veteran deputy and friend of Hall's, drew his weapon, shouting commands for Nichols to stop. But Nichols turned, raised his gun, and fired. The bullet struck Teasley, killing him instantly. The escape was complete. Nichols darted into the crowded streets of Atlanta, blending into the Friday morning chaos. He hijacked a series of vehicles, including a green Honda Accord, and vanished into the city. Within minutes, news of the courthouse shooting spread across police radio networks. Dispatchers scrambled to identify the suspect. Officers poured into downtown streets, setting up roadblocks and sealing off exits. But Nichols was already gone. By midday, the city was under lockdown. Helicopters circled overhead, and every major news outlet broke the story. A sitting judge and 2 courthouse employees had been murdered. A deputy lay dead. The gunman was armed, trained in self-defense from his college wrestling days, and desperate. The manhunt that followed would become one of the largest in Georgia's history. Authorities described Nichols as extremely dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose. As investigators searched the courthouse, the scene inside painted a chilling picture of precision and rage. Forensic teams found Cynthia Hall's blood-stained uniform near the holding cell, her body barely conscious when discovered. She was rushed to Grady Memorial Hospital, her injuries critical but not fatal. Meanwhile, crime scene photos captured the brutal aftermath in Judge Barnes's courtroom papers scattered, bullet holes in the walls, and a half-written court transcript lying beside Brandau's fallen hand. While police searched downtown, Nichols navigated back roads and residential streets, switching vehicles and discarding evidence. He had one goal: to stay ahead of law enforcement long enough to disappear. But Nichols was not just running, was spiraling. The transformation from inmate to fugitive had happened in minutes, and every decision he made now was survival-driven. Authorities speculated that Nichols might target anyone who recognized him, heightening the sense of fear across the city. As daylight faded, police established command centers and issued public warnings. Citizens were urged to lock doors and report any suspicious activity. Atlanta, a city known for its southern warmth, found itself frozen in collective anxiety. By evening, Nichols had already expanded his crime spree. He broke into a suburban home, confronting a couple and stealing their car at gunpoint. Later that night, he encountered David Wilhelm, a 40-year-old U.S. Customs agent, outside his house in Buckhead. Nichols shot him, killing him instantly, before stealing his truck, badge, and service weapon. The killing of Wilhelm added another layer of urgency to the already frantic search. Nichols now had multiple firearms and official credentials, tools that allowed him to move more freely. Investigators feared he might attempt to flee the state or take new hostages. The FBI, state troopers, and local police joined forces, deploying more than 1,000 officers in the search. Roadblocks stretched across highways, and officers went door to door in neighborhoods where Nichols was last seen. By midnight, Nichols had driven deep into residential areas of Duluth, north of Atlanta. There, in a small apartment complex, a young woman named Ashley Smith was returning home from a late-night errand. She had no idea that the next few hours would thrust her into the center of one of America's most infamous manhunts. Nichols spotted her and followed her inside at gunpoint. It was there, in her quiet apartment, that the story would take an unexpected turn. One that would shift from terror to humanity, and from chaos to a moment of grace. The manhunt outside continued through the night. Police scanners buzzed, SWAT teams waited on standby, and helicopters searched the skies. But the killer they sought had found shelter in the most unlikely place. The home of a young widow who would soon do what an army of officers could not: end the nightmare without another drop of blood. The city held its breath as the night deepened, unaware that the final act of the Fulton County Courthouse tragedy was about to unfold behind closed doors. Ashley Smith's apartment was modest, quiet, and tucked away in a suburban complex miles from downtown Atlanta. It was after midnight when she returned home, holding a bag of groceries and keys in hand, exhausted after a long day. She was a 26-year-old widow and mother, still rebuilding her life after years of struggle and grief. But as she approached her door, a tall, muscular man suddenly appeared from the shadows. He pressed a gun to her ribs and ordered her inside. In that instant, her heart froze. She didn't know his name yet, but every news channel in Georgia already did. The man standing in her living room was Brian Nichols, the courthouse killer who had spent the last 24 hours leaving a trail of blood across Atlanta. Inside, Nichols moved with the precision of a man still running on adrenaline. He shut the blinds, locked the doors, and made sure no one could see in from outside. Ashley's mind raced. She knew that one wrong move could end her life. The police were searching for him everywhere. But here he was, in her home, holding her hostage with calm menace. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, telling her that he wasn't going to hurt her if she cooperated. His voice was steady but cold, his eyes darting constantly toward the windows. He had killed for people in less than a day, but now he seemed oddly composed, as if the violence had drained something out of him. Ashley offered him food, trying to stay calm, and Nichols accepted. He ate quickly, pacing between the living room and the kitchen, his weapon always within reach. He asked if she had a car and if she lived alone. When she said yes, he nodded slowly, absorbing every detail. He looked around the apartment, the photos on the wall, the books on the table, the framed picture of Ashley's late husband. In a strange twist of fate, that image would become a bridge between captor and hostage, a silent reminder of shared loss and fractured humanity. Nichols eventually sat down and began talking. It wasn't the kind of conversation Ashley expected. He spoke about his trial, insisting that he had been wronged, that he was no monster. He claimed the system had turned against him, that people lied to destroy his life. Ashley listened quietly, afraid to provoke him. He told her he hadn't meant to kill anyone, that everything had happened too fast, that he just wanted freedom. The calm in his voice was eerie, the voice of a man rationalizing the irrational. Hours passed. The television in the background showed news coverage of the manhunt. Helicopter lights swept across the city skyline as reporters described Nichols as armed and extremely dangerous. Ashley watched the footage in silence, praying that police would somehow find her before it was too late. But Nichols seemed fascinated by his own story being told on screen. "They're making me sound like an animal," he said quietly. "They don't know the truth." His words carried a strange conviction, as if he genuinely believed his actions were justified. At one point, Ashley asked if she could smoke a cigarette on the balcony. Nichols refused. He told her that if she tried to signal anyone, he would kill her without hesitation. She believed him. Instead, she focused on survival, keeping him calm, buying time, and humanizing herself in his eyes. She told him about her daughter, about her struggles with addiction, and about the loss of her husband in a stabbing years earlier. For a brief moment, Nichols seemed to soften. He listened, nodding, and even told her that he understood pain. It was the first sign that beneath his hardened exterior, something human still flickered. Around 3 a.m., Nichols found a copy of a book on her table, The Purpose-Driven Life by Rick Warren. He picked it up, curious, and asked her about it. Ashley, sensing an opportunity to connect with him, began reading aloud. The section she chose spoke about forgiveness, purpose, and redemption, words that seemed to slow Nichols down. As she read, his shoulders relaxed slightly. For the first time that night, the air in the room felt less suffocating. Nichols told her he wanted to find a new life, that maybe God had given him another chance. Ashley encouraged this thought gently, knowing it could save her. The two talked for hours, shifting between scripture and confession. Nichols spoke of his mother, his son, and how prison had destroyed his sense of identity. Ashley told him that running wouldn't change anything, that maybe surrender was the only way he could reclaim what was left of his soul. Her words were steady, measured, and deeply empathetic. Not because she trusted him, but because she knew compassion might be her only weapon. By dawn, the atmosphere in the apartment had changed. Nichols's anger had begun to dissolve into fatigue. He had been awake for nearly 2 days, and the weight of his crimes seemed to settle on him at last. He put the gun down on the coffee table, rubbed his face, and said softly, "Maybe I should just give up." Ashley's heart leapt at those words, but she hid her reaction. She told him it was the right thing to do, that his mother deserved to know he was alive, that ending the violence would be an act of courage, not weakness. Nichols nodded but remained uncertain. caught between survival instinct and the growing awareness that his life was already over. Ashley prepared breakfast pancakes and orange juice and acted so ordinary it felt surreal. Nichols ate quietly, his demeanor now more subdued than menacing. She could sense he was wrestling with himself, the adrenaline gone, replaced by guilt and exhaustion. When he finished eating, he asked if he could take a shower. She said yes, using those moments to plan her next move. Her phone sat on the counter. One call could end everything. But she waited. Timing, she knew, was everything. "Floor, you really think God can forgive me?" he asked. Ashley didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said softly. "But you have to stop running." There was a long silence. Then Nichols exhaled deeply and said, "Maybe you're right." Ashley knew it was her chance. She told him she needed to see her daughter, that she couldn't keep hiding. Nichols nodded, handing her the keys to her car. "Go ahead," he said. "Don't tell anyone yet. I just need a little more time to think." She agreed, her pulse racing, and walked toward the door. The moment she stepped outside, she didn't look back. She got into her car, drove a short distance, and called 911. Within minutes, the quiet apartment complex erupted with police vehicles. SWAT teams surrounded the building, weapons drawn, ready for confrontation. But when Nichols realized what was happening, he didn't fight. He placed his gun on the kitchen counter and waited. The man who had unleashed terror across Atlanta stepped out peacefully, hands raised. It was over. Inside the police command center, officers exchanged stunned looks as news came through. The fugitive had surrendered without another shot fired. The woman who had faced him alone for nearly 7 hours had done what hundreds of armed men could not. She had brought the killer to his knees with faith, empathy, and the power of words. For Ashley Smith, the nightmare had ended, but the story of her courage was only beginning. For Atlanta, the long, bloody day that began inside a courthouse had finally come full circle, ending not with another gunshot, but with a quiet act of grace at dawn. When the news broke that Brian Nichols had surrendered peacefully after a 26-hour manhunt, the city of Atlanta exhaled for the first time in 2 days. The tension that had gripped the streets dissolved into a mix of relief, disbelief, and mourning. Helicopters hovered over the apartment complex where Nichols had been captured, broadcasting live footage of armed officers leading him away in handcuffs. For the families of his victims, the sight of him alive brought little comfort. For people were dead Judge Roland Barnes, court reporter Julie Brandau, Deputy Hoyt Teasley, and U.S. Customs Agent David Wilhelm, all killed in what had begun as one man's desperate attempt to escape justice. But amid the devastation, the survival of Ashley Smith stood as a rare glimmer of humanity in an otherwise dark chapter of Georgia's history. Police immediately secured the area, clearing neighbors and swarming the apartment Nichols had used as his refuge. Forensic teams cataloged every item: the weapon he left on the counter, the book The Purpose-Driven Life, the remnants of breakfast still on the table. Every detail became a piece of the puzzle that prosecutors would later use to reconstruct the mind of the man who had brought chaos to Atlanta. Nichols was taken to the Fulton County Jail, placed under maximum security, and surrounded by guards who now knew exactly what he was capable of. His demeanor during booking was calm, almost detached. He spoke little, his eyes vacant. To the officers processing him, it was difficult to reconcile this quiet man with the brutal killer whose actions had dominated national headlines. As the investigation unfolded, the enormity of the tragedy became clear. The courthouse, once a symbol of justice, was now scarred by violence. In the days following the attack, flowers and notes covered the steps where Deputy Teasley had fallen. Vigils were held for Judge Barnes and Julie Brandau, whose deaths sent shockwaves through the legal community. Court employees returned to work under heavy security, but the atmosphere had changed forever. Fear lingered in every hallway, and the memory of that morning's gunfire echoed in every courtroom session that followed. For Ashley Smith, life after the ordeal was equally complicated. Overnight, she became the face of courage, a young widow who had faced a murderer and survived not through strength or force, but through compassion and faith. Media outlets flooded her with interview requests. Some praised her for her bravery. Others questioned her choices, wondering if she had done enough to alert authorities sooner. But Ashley knew that judgment came easily to those who hadn't been there, hadn't felt the cold barrel of a gun pressed against their skin. Her only goal that night had been survival and, somehow, she had found a way to end the bloodshed without another life being lost. In the weeks that followed, Ashley wrote about her experience, describing the strange calm that had overtaken her as she spoke to Nichols. She said that reading The Purpose-Driven Life had not been a calculated act, it was instinct, something she felt guided to do in that moment. "I didn't see a monster," she told reporters later. "I saw a broken man who needed someone to remind him of his humanity." Her words struck a chord across the country, transforming her from a hostage into a symbol of redemption. She later published a memoir titled Unlikely Angel, which detailed not only her night with Nichols, but also her own journey through addiction, grief, and spiritual renewal. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared for one of the most closely watched trials in Georgia's history. Nichols faced multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, armed robbery, and assault. The evidence against him was overwhelming: eyewitnesses, ballistic tests, and a trail of stolen vehicles that mapped his escape route across Atlanta. The defense team argued that Nichols suffered from mental instability and paranoia, that his actions were not the product of cold calculation but of psychological collapse. But the prosecution saw no room for sympathy. The attack had been deliberate, precise, and sustained over hours. It was not a momentary lapse of control. It was a campaign of violence. In court, Nichols appeared emotionless, his head bowed as witnesses recounted the events. Cynthia Hall, the deputy he had nearly beaten to death, testified from a wheelchair, describing the moment he overpowered her and took her gun. Her voice trembled, but her resolve was unshaken. She had lived barely to tell her story. When Ashley Smith took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Her testimony was steady, measured, and deeply human. She described the night in her apartment not as an act of heroism but as a moment of connection between two people on opposite sides of desperation. "He told me he wanted to start over," she said softly. "I told him it wasn't too late to do the right thing." The trial lasted several months, drawing national coverage and sparking debates about courtroom security, mental health in the justice system, and the thin line between law and chaos. Every day, family members of the victims filled the gallery, searching for answers that could never truly come. On December 13, 2008, the verdict was read. Brian Nichols was found guilty on all charges. Despite calls from prosecutors for the death penalty, the jury spared his life, sentencing him instead to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For some, it was justice served. For others, it was a reminder that no sentence could undo the pain he had caused. Nichols was transferred to Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson, where he remains to this day, confined to a cell that mirrors the life he once fought so violently to escape. In the aftermath, the state of Georgia launched an extensive review of courthouse security procedures. It was discovered that multiple warnings about Nichols's violent behavior had been overlooked. Deputies had requested additional guards for his transport that morning, but those requests were never fulfilled. The tragedy became a catalyst for reform. Metal detectors were upgraded, staffing protocols were rewritten, and new training programs were introduced to prevent such a breach from ever happening again. The Fulton County Courthouse reopened months later under tighter restrictions, but the shadow of that day remained. For those who worked there, it wasn't just a workplace anymore, it was sacred ground marked by loss. The memory of the victims continued to resonate throughout the community. Judge Barnes was remembered as a man of patience and compassion, a mentor who believed that justice should always be tempered with mercy. Julie Brandau was celebrated for her dedication and warmth, a professional who treated every case as if it mattered personally. Deputy Teasley was honored as a hero who died protecting others, his name etched on the Law Enforcement Memorial in Atlanta. And David Wilhelm, the federal agent killed in his driveway, was mourned as a devoted husband, brother, and public servant. Their stories became the heart of memorial ceremonies, reminding everyone that behind every headline were lives once full of laughter, work, and love. Years later, Ashley Smith reflected on the experience that had changed both her life and the city's history. She often said that she didn't see herself as brave, only as someone who had been placed in an impossible situation and guided by faith to do the right thing. Her encounter with Nichols had not only saved her life, but had also transformed her perspective on purpose, forgiveness, and the fragile line between victim and survivor. The Fulton County Courthouse shooting remains one of the darkest chapters in Atlanta's modern history story of failure and heroism, of horror and humanity intertwined. It exposed the vulnerability within the justice system but also revealed the strength of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. From the brutal attack in a courthouse hallway to the quiet surrender in a suburban apartment, the events of those 26 hours became a haunting reminder of how quickly order can collapse and how, sometimes, it takes compassion rather than force to bring peace back from the brink. Inside one of Connecticut's most secure prisons, a shocking murder shattered the illusion of control. When a quiet inmate calmly confessed to strangling his cellmate in the dead of night, investigators uncovered a chilling story of madness, neglect, and silence behind bars. What drove him and who truly failed? On the morning of December 12, 2023, the MacDougall Walker Correctional Institution in Suffield, Connecticut, woke to a stillness that felt wrong. Inside the sprawling concrete complex that houses over 1,500 of the state's most dangerous inmates, silence usually signified control, a fragile peace maintained by strict routine and constant surveillance. But on that day, that silence was broken by a chilling radio call from one of the cell blocks. Within minutes, correctional officers rushed to a common area where they found the lifeless body of 26-year-old inmate Kenneth Montaner Buscampel, laid out neatly on a table as if placed there for viewing. Standing beside him, calm and motionless, was his cellmate, Kyle McKinnon, a 31-year-old inmate whose face betrayed no hint of fear, remorse, or confusion. When asked what happened, McKinnon's answer was simple: "He's dead. I did it." The discovery stunned everyone inside the prison. In an environment where violence was expected but usually prevented, the idea that one man could quietly kill another in his sleep and then carry his body into the open without anyone noticing raised immediate questions about oversight and safety. Guards quickly secured the area as medical staff attempted to revive Montaner Buscampel, but it was clear there was nothing to be done. His skin had turned pale, his neck bore visible bruising, and his chest no longer rose. The autopsy later confirmed what McKinnon had already confessed: death by manual strangulation, a slow and personal act of violence that takes deliberate effort and chilling resolve. Inside prisons, motives for murder often trace back to debts, gang rivalries, or acts of revenge. But in this case, investigators faced a mystery. There was no known conflict between McKinnon and his victim, no disciplinary record of fights, and no recent tension noted by staff. Both men had been considered low risk within the maximum security population, neither part of gangs, neither showing violent tendencies. McKinnon had a reputation among some inmates as a loner, someone who kept to himself, occasionally speaking in short, cryptic phrases. Others described him as unpredictable, prone to long periods of silence followed by bursts of strange behavior, muttering to himself, staring at the walls, pacing his cell during the night. For weeks before the murder, there were subtle signs that something was shifting in McKinnon's demeanor. He had withdrawn even further, refusing meals at times and avoiding the recreation yard. Some inmates recalled him mumbling about voices, while one correctional officer remembered catching him standing motionless near the door of his cell, eyes fixed on something invisible. These fragments of behavior, dismissed as typical symptoms of prison stress, would later be examined with scrutiny. After the killing, psychologists assigned to the investigation speculated that McKinnon's mind may have fractured long before the attack, his violence not rooted in anger, but in delusion. Kenneth Montaner Buscampel's story stood in tragic contrast. At 26, he was still young, serving time for nonviolent offenses, reportedly involving property and drug-related crimes. He was soft-spoken and polite, the kind of inmate who stayed out of trouble and respected the hierarchy of prison life. He had only been at MacDougall Walker for a short while, transferred there from another facility as part of a reclassification process. Sharing a cell with McKinnon was supposed to be routine, just another pairing made by prison administration based on available space. No one predicted that the decision would end his life. Investigators later pieced together the sequence of events from McKinnon's confession and forensic evidence. According to his statement, the attack occurred sometime during the night. Montaner Buscampel had already fallen asleep when McKinnon decided to act. There was no argument, no warning. McKinnon approached his cellmate quietly, pressed his hands against his throat, and applied pressure until he stopped breathing. He claimed to have watched him struggle for a few moments before the movement ceased. The act was methodical and disturbingly calm. Once certain that Montaner Buscampel was dead, McKinnon sat beside the body for a while, staring at it in silence before deciding what to do next. What came afterward was even more unnerving. Instead of attempting to hide the crime or alert guards immediately, McKinnon lifted the body, a heavy, limp form, and carried it through the narrow corridor of the housing unit to a communal area. Surveillance cameras later showed him walking steadily, unhurried, stopping near a table where he carefully placed the body, arranging it as if setting down an object rather than a human being. He then waited. When officers finally responded to his call, they found him sitting nearby, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on nothing. His confession was short and emotionless. The scene left a lasting impact on every officer who witnessed it. Veteran guards, hardened by years of dealing with violence, described a sense of unease unlike anything they had felt before. There was something almost ritualistic about the way McKinnon handled the aftermath. A sense that he wasn't driven by rage or impulse but by some internal logic that only he understood. As investigators combed through the cell, they found no weapon, no note, no sign of struggle. The bunk bed was neatly made on McKinnon's side. Montaner Buscampel's blanket was crumpled, the only indication of the brief and fatal resistance that never had a chance. No fingerprints other than the two men's were found, confirming McKinnon's solitary involvement. When questioned by detectives, McKinnon remained composed. His responses were direct, almost polite. Asked why he did it, he paused for several seconds before answering, "I don't know. I just knew I had to." That single statement became the centerpiece of the prosecution's argument and the defense's mystery. Was it a deliberate killing born out of suppressed aggression? Or was it the tragic result of untreated mental illness festering in confinement? Behind the thick walls of MacDougall Walker, life moved on, but not without whispers. Inmates spoke quietly about the murder, some blaming the system for pairing McKinnon with someone vulnerable, others claiming he had been talking about death in the days before. The staff tightened supervision protocols, but many felt a lingering sense of failure. For a place designed to control every aspect of human behavior, how could something so deliberate have gone unnoticed? The Connecticut Department of Corrections soon launched a full internal investigation. Teams reviewed surveillance footage, staff reports, and medical records to determine if warning signs had been overlooked. Officials faced pressure from outside agencies and the media, with the case gaining traction through outlets like CT Insider, which described the killing as a chilling reminder that even under total control, the human mind can be a danger to itself and others. As McKinnon awaited trial, he remained largely silent, spending his days in a segregated cell away from the general population. Psychiatrists assessed him multiple times, trying to determine whether he understood the gravity of his actions. Their evaluations would become central to the unfolding legal battle. Meanwhile, Kenneth Montaner Buscampel's family received the devastating news. His mother, in a statement released later, said her son was trying to rebuild his life and didn't deserve to die behind bars in a place meant to protect him. The tragedy was more than just a single act of violence. It was a reflection of something deeper, something broken within the prison system. The first part of the story ends where the questions begin. What drove Kyle McKinnon to commit such a cold and senseless murder? And how did a place built on order and control allow madness to slip quietly through its walls? The answers would slowly emerge in the investigations and testimonies that followed, revealing that behind every act of violence in confinement lies a chain of missed warnings, human neglect, and the dark psychology of isolation. In the weeks following the murder, the halls of MacDougall Walker Correctional Institution were heavy with suspicion and unease. Guards walked their rounds with new caution. Inmates whispered rumors between locked doors, and administrators moved quickly to contain the fallout. A murder inside a high-security prison was not just a tragedy. It was a failure of protocol, a public embarrassment for a system designed to prevent precisely this kind of event. The Connecticut Department of Correction launched a full internal inquiry, interviewing dozens of staff members, reviewing surveillance footage, and dissecting every moment of Kyle McKinnon's incarceration leading up to the night of December 12, 2023. What they found painted a picture far more complex than a simple act of violence. Kyle McKinnon's file was extensive but uneventful. He had been in and out of the system for years, mostly for mid-level offenses, burglary, assault, and possession charges, but nothing that marked him as especially dangerous. His behavioral reports from previous facilities described him as compliant, sometimes detached, and often solitary. There were occasional notes about mood instability and withdrawn behavior, but nothing that indicated an imminent threat. Psych evaluations from his earlier incarceration suggested he might have been struggling with undiagnosed mental illness, possibly schizophrenia or severe depression, but the system had never followed up on those recommendations. Like many inmates, McKinnon had simply fallen through the cracks, too quiet to be considered a problem, too strange to be fully understood. When the internal investigators sat down with correctional officers who knew McKinnon, a pattern began to emerge. One officer recalled him staring blankly at his cell wall for hours, sometimes whispering under his breath. Another mentioned that McKinnon had once refused to come out for routine cell checks, claiming that someone was waiting for him outside who wanted him dead. Fellow inmates told stories that sounded even more chilling. One said McKinnon had spoken about hearing voices at night, voices that told him to make things right. Another described how McKinnon had become obsessed with the idea that his cellmate was evil. Whether these accounts were true or exaggerated was difficult to prove, but they hinted at a mental collapse that had gone unnoticed or unaddressed by staff. Meanwhile, Kenneth Montaner Buscampel's family was grappling with their own disbelief. Kenneth had been due for a parole hearing within the year, and according to his mother, he had been optimistic about starting fresh. He had written to her only days before the incident, telling her he was staying strong and looking forward to getting out. His death devastated her, but what haunted her most was the way it happened. Quietly, without warning, at the hands of a man who had been living inches away. During interviews, she expressed anger not just toward McKinnon, but toward the prison system itself, accusing officials of negligence. "They put my son in a cage with a man who was clearly unwell," she said in a televised statement. "They knew and they ignored it." As the investigation unfolded, details emerged that reinforced her accusation. Reports showed that McKinnon had been placed in general population despite multiple flags in his file suggesting a history of paranoia and aggression. A mental health evaluation done months earlier had noted signs of delusion but concluded he was fit for regular housing. It became clear that budget cuts and understaffing had stretched the prison's mental health services thin. Psychologists were responsible for evaluating dozens of inmates each week, leaving little time for follow-ups or in-depth assessments. McKinnon, like many others, had been reduced to a line in a report, a potential risk never fully examined. When McKinnon was interviewed by detectives, his demeanor remained unsettlingly calm. The interrogation footage, later described by sources who viewed it, showed a man devoid of visible emotion. Sitting across from investigators, he answered their questions with short, factual responses, as though recounting something routine. "Why did you kill Kenneth?" one detective asked. McKinnon's gaze remained steady. "He wasn't supposed to be here," he said. "I had to fix it." When pressed to explain, he spoke of feeling watched and tested. His words hinted at delusional thinking, some distorted perception that his cellmate was part of a larger scheme against him. "He kept trying to control my thoughts," he added softly. "So I stopped him." Psychiatrists reviewing this footage concluded that McKinnon was likely suffering from severe psychosis at the time of the murder. But proving legal insanity in court is a different matter altogether. Under Connecticut law, a defendant can be found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect only if it's shown they were unable to understand the nature or wrongfulness of their act. McKinnon's confession complicated this. He clearly knew what he had done. He admitted to strangling Kenneth, carrying the body out and waiting for guards to find it. That deliberate sequence of actions could suggest awareness, even if distorted by delusion. Prosecutors argued that this awareness meant intent, and intent meant murder. Inside the prison, the atmosphere grew tense. Many inmates began refusing cellmates, demanding to be housed alone. Rumors spread that McKinnon had been hearing voices from the vents, and some claimed that guards had laughed it off. Correctional officers, now under scrutiny, were defensive. They insisted there had been no clear indication that McKinnon was dangerous. One veteran officer, speaking anonymously, said, "You see strange behavior all the time in here. If we locked up every inmate who talked to themselves, we'd run out of cells." The internal review, however, told a different story. It found that several staff members had indeed documented McKinnon's erratic behavior, but those reports never made it past the administrative level. Paperwork was delayed, recommendations overlooked, and communication between departments had broken down. In short, the system had seen the warning signs, but no one acted. By February 2024, McKinnon's case had become a public scandal. News outlets like CT Insider, NBC Connecticut, and Hartford Courant ran detailed features about the murder, each highlighting the same theme: the failure of mental health care in state prisons. Editorials questioned how many similar tragedies might be quietly brewing behind closed doors. The Department of Correction issued a statement promising reforms: more staff training, better mental health evaluations, and new procedures for housing inmates with psychiatric concerns. But for the families involved, these promises felt hollow. Meanwhile, McKinnon sat in isolation, awaiting trial. Prison psychiatrists noted that he appeared lucid most days but occasionally slipped into detached, incoherent speech. He showed no signs of remorse and refused to discuss the incident further, often saying he had already done what needed to be done. When guards brought him meals, he would thank them politely but avoid eye contact. He rarely left his cell except for mandatory checkups. One doctor described him as a man suspended between awareness and delusion, a person who understood what he had done but not why. For the investigators, understanding that why became an obsession. They reconstructed his last weeks, interviewing everyone who had spoken to him. A pattern emerged: fragmented conversations about cleansing, about truth, and about his belief that someone was planting thoughts in his mind. Psych experts later said these were classic symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, likely untreated and exacerbated by years of isolation. As the story unfolded, it exposed a grim reality about life inside maximum security prisons. Mental illness, often ignored or misunderstood, becomes invisible until it explodes into violence. McKinnon's case wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. What made it unforgettable was its coldness, the methodical calm of a man who killed not out of rage, but from a twisted sense of necessity. By the end of the second month of investigation, one fact was undeniable: the system had failed both men. Kenneth Montaner Buscampel, a young inmate trying to serve his time peacefully, was failed by lax oversight. Kyle McKinnon, spiraling deeper into delusion, was failed by the absence of care. Together, their lives intersected in one cell, a confined space that became the stage for a tragedy that no one saw coming. And as the case prepared to move to court, the question remained: was Kyle McKinnon a cold-blooded killer, or a broken mind abandoned by the system that created him? By the time Kyle McKinnon's case reached court in the spring of 2024, it had become one of Connecticut's most discussed prison murder trials in recent years. The courtroom was a world far removed from the cold gray walls of MacDougall Walker, yet the atmosphere carried the same sense of confinement, tension thick enough to be felt in the air. Reporters filled the benches, family members sat in the gallery with folded hands, and the man at the center of it all remained eerily composed. McKinnon's expression was the same as it had been on the morning of the murder: blank, detached, as if he were observing someone else's life unfold. The trial would determine whether he would spend the rest of his life behind bars or inside a psychiatric facility. But the deeper question that haunted everyone was not just about punishment. It was about understanding what had driven him to kill. Prosecutors presented their case with clinical precision. They showed the jury photographs of the crime scene: Kenneth Montaner Buscampel's body laid on the table, the faint marks of pressure on his neck, and the expression of peaceful stillness that had chilled investigators. They replayed McKinnon's confession, his calm voice admitting to strangling his cellmate and carrying the body into the open. The prosecution's argument was clear. This was not a crime of passion or confusion, but a deliberate act. They emphasized McKinnon's composure, his decision to alert the guards afterward, and his ability to describe the murder step by step. He knew exactly what he was doing, the lead prosecutor told the court. He planned it, executed it, and confessed without hesitation. That is not insanity, it is intent. The defense took a different stance. They called psychiatrists, correctional staff, and mental health experts who had interacted with McKinnon over the years. Their case rested on the idea that his actions were the product of untreated psychosis, not conscious malice. One psychiatrist testified that McKinnon's behavior aligned with symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, hallucinations, delusional beliefs, and emotional flatness. He explained how years of isolation and lack of medication could easily have deepened McKinnon's detachment from reality. Another expert described how inmates suffering from mental illness often mask their symptoms out of fear of punishment, making it difficult for staff to recognize danger until it's too late. The defense's narrative was simple but haunting. Kyle McKinnon was not a killer in control of his mind. He was a patient lost inside it. As the testimony unfolded, the courtroom listened in uneasy silence. Portions of McKinnon's journal were read aloud. Cryptic entries filled with fragmented thoughts and recurring words like control, cleansing, and truth. In one entry, written weeks before the murder, he scrawled, "The noise won't stop. He knows. I must make it quiet." Those words sent a visible ripple through the courtroom. For Kenneth Montaner Buscampel's family, it was almost unbearable. His mother wept quietly, clutching a photograph of her son taken just months before his death. For them, no psychological explanation could justify what had been done. The jury struggled to reconcile the two versions of McKinnon, the calm, coherent man who confessed to murder, and the disturbed figure painted by the defense. When McKinnon himself took the stand, the divide grew even starker. Dressed in a plain prison uniform, he spoke softly, almost mechanically. "I didn't want to hurt him," he said, "but he was trying to control me. I felt it. Every time I tried to sleep, he was there in my head. I had to stop it." When asked if he knew killing was wrong, he hesitated. "It depends on what you mean by wrong," he answered. "It felt like it was the only thing left to do." Forensic psychologists later said that this kind of detachment, knowing an act is considered wrong but believing it's necessary, was a classic symptom of delusional compulsion. But for the court, the line between mental illness and responsibility was razor-thin. After days of deliberation, the jury rejected the insanity defense. McKinnon was found guilty of murder and first-degree strangulation. The verdict brought a sense of closure for the prosecution, but for many observers, it raised more questions than answers. Was justice truly served when the killer was a man lost in delusion? Or was this simply another example of a system punishing illness instead of treating it? McKinnon was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, to be served in a high-security psychiatric unit within the correctional system. The judge, acknowledging the tragedy on both sides, remarked, "This is a case where two lives were destroyed, one by death and the other by madness." Those words captured the uneasy truth that lingered long after the courtroom emptied. Back inside MacDougall Walker, life eventually returned to its brutal routine. New inmates arrived, old ones were transferred out, and the incident that had once shaken the entire facility became another story whispered in the corridors. But among the staff, the memory remained vivid. Correctional officers who had known McKinnon said they often replayed his calm confession in their minds. Some admitted they blamed themselves for missing the warning signs, while others argued that the system had given them no tools to prevent it. "We're not trained to deal with mental illness," one officer said later. "We're trained to maintain order. But how do you keep order in someone's head?" The Department of Correction implemented several policy changes in the aftermath. There were new mental health screening protocols, mandatory training sessions for staff on recognizing psychological distress, and a push for better coordination between medical and security divisions. Still, many insiders doubted whether those changes would make much difference. The problem, they said, wasn't policy, it was capacity. The prison simply didn't have enough resources or personnel to handle the volume of inmates needing psychiatric care. McKinnon's case became a symbol of that failure, cited in advocacy reports and legislative hearings about the state's correctional system. For Kenneth's family, however, reforms offered little comfort. They continued to fight for answers, filing civil claims against the state for negligence. In interviews, his mother spoke not just of her son's death, but of the many families facing similar grief. "There are hundreds of men like Kyle in those cells," she said, "and there are hundreds like my son, just trying to survive their sentence. If no one listens, it'll happen again." Her words became a quiet indictment of a system that often confuses control with care. Years from now, the case of Kyle McKinnon and Kenneth Montaner Buscampel will likely be remembered less for its brutality and more for what it revealed about life inside maximum security walls. It showed that even in places built to contain violence, the most dangerous battles are often invisible, fought within the mind. It showed how bureaucracy and neglect can turn silence into catastrophe. And it showed that behind every inmate's name and number, there is a fragile human story waiting to be ignored until it's too late. As of today, McKinnon remains confined, living in near-total isolation under psychiatric supervision. Those who have seen him describe him as distant, polite, and hauntingly calm. The same calm that once preceded a murder. He spends hours writing in his journal, rarely speaking to anyone. When asked recently by a prison psychiatrist if he ever thought about the man he killed, McKinnon reportedly answered, "I think about the quiet. That's all I wanted." The story of this prison killing ends not with redemption, but with reflection. It stands as a dark reminder of what happens when mental illness meets indifference, when systems designed to rehabilitate turn into warehouses of despair. Inside those walls, one man's delusion became another man's death, and the silence that followed still echoes through the corridors of MacDougall Walker. A silence born from tragedy, sustained by neglect, and remembered as the sound of a system that failed them both.